Good Monday morning, and I want to talk a little bit about things that I saw over the weekend. And I want to look at some of these things, and I want you to I want you to think you're around a question. The question is to ask yourself, where does this go from here? I think a lot of people are like looking at things in the moment and going like, when is somebody going to come and help us? Where are the good Republicans? How is this going to stop? And I think what it is just everyone wants to go back to normal, and that's not going to happen. And I think you need to ask yourself, not only where does this go from here, but how is my privilege blinding me to where this goes from here? And there's all different kinds of privilege. I think we all know what they are, but especially white privilege. And I want us to think about that. And this is why I know that The Handmaid's Tale gets a lot of criticism, fair enough. But one of the reasons why I think it's a really important tool, and it's a book that it's one of the many books that I teach in my schooling with my children, is because white people have a very hard time recognizing injustices for how severe they are when they don't see it on whiteness. And so reading the book Handmaid's Tale and knowing that everything that happened to it has already happened in history, and most, if not all of it, was perpetrated at the hands of white people onto people that weren't white, or by the hands of men onto people who aren't men. And knowing that, I think that it can hit people a little bit more deeply, a little more profoundly. I mean, we see that with the Republicans, right? They're against something until it happens to their family, and then they can change their stance on it or whatever. Or if they don't do that, but I mean, that's how it's been historically. So I think that it's good to read books, that book, because it allows you to do that. And so now I'm like knowing that, like looking at some other things. So like I watched Dr. Teresa Borenpole attend when she was this week, and she attended a community town hall put on by a conservative group, but open to the public. And she was critical when she was there. She spoke out of turn, but it was the typical kind of stuff, that people do at these kinds of things. Other people were jeering and cheering for harmful policies, and there was no criticism of those people. But if she said, women are dying, when they talked about Roe v. Wade, or that a local politician had stolen some lumber, and just simple statements, then that was too much. And a off-duty sheriff came over to her and threatened to pepper spray her if she didn't leave. He did have a badge on his belt, and he had a ball cap on that said that he was a sheriff. But then he called over some men, younger men, who did not have security anywhere on them. They did not have badges. They did not identify themselves. They were dressed all the same, but not in uniform. But it was like black military-esque, kind of stuff that you might see like in an Army Navy store. And they manhandled her and assaulted her. They put her onto the ground. They zip tied her. At one point when they were carrying out, her shirt almost came off. She had no idea what they were doing with her, who they were, where they were taking her. Was she under arrest? Was she being kidnapped? She did bite one of them because of that. And it turned out they were a private security firm. By law, they were required to wear security on their clothing. They were not. And I don't know where this case will go from here, but watching it gives you chills, right? But you need to ask yourself, where else am I seeing this? Where else have I seen this recently? I mean, we saw this all over the place with related to Black Lives Matter. We see this. I watched during the last Trump administration, some disabled protesters showed up to my Senator Rob Portman, and they were dragged out of their wheelchairs with their shirts coming up in exactly the same way. The only difference there is that they knew that they were the police. And so we need to be looking at, putting this into context. How did this go down in the history? Where does this go from here if this escalates? And why is it that I'm not noticing it until this point? And start to look at all the other things that you see that seem similar. Another thing that I'm seeing that I think shows like some privilege is, I'm watching people I'm seeing some guys that I know speaking up, and I have not seen that, to be totally honest with you. And most of my friends are fairly liberal. I have, friends, all different kinds of friends, but I'm seeing a lot of people quiet. And I'm very appreciative of the people that I see using their voice. And they're not just posting stuff that other people have written. They're writing things from their heart about this. And I love that. I love them for that. And but I'm watching the comments and the other men that are their friends that respond to these things. And it is just, there is like no ability in these guys to understand fully what they're talking about. They can be pedantic and they can, all the typical stuff that you can imagine. And they're not asking themselves where this goes. So, like, talking about Social Security, for example, and, how they potentially losing it and how, like, well, it sucked anyways. And I didn't get the return of investment I would have gotten if I had just had that cash myself that me and my employer put into it. And if I would have invested that myself, I could have made, a couple $1,000,000 by the time I would be retirement age and da 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 da. And I mean, like, ask yourself what happens if you were to have had that cash. First of all, would you have really invested it? Come on. Okay, come on. If you had that cash invested but you were 18 years old and 1 month into a new job and you got terribly injured or very, very ill and became disabled, you'd have almost nothing. What would you live on with that? A month? A year? Come on. Social Security is a social contract made between us and our employers and the government so that anybody can be protected. If you live long enough to retire, you should be using that. You should have that money available to you retire. But God forbid you get injured or disabled in some way and you can no longer work. You still have money to live on. You don't have to die on a blanket on a sidewalk. That should mean something to you. You should not want to live in a world where to get to work, you have to walk past people who have died during the night because it got cold. Like, do you even hear yourselves? If you see that they're thinking about cutting Medicaid, do you know people in a nursing home? Do you have parents or grandparents that are elderly? Do you not just does your privilege mean that you haven't had to really pay attention to how they paid to live there? I worked in nursing homes for most of my life. The majority of the people in the nursing homes I worked at were living there because of Medicaid. So these were people that were hardworking people. They worked their whole lives. Everything that they were supposed to do, they did. They crossed every a T and dotted every I. And when they became older, they got sick and their families couldn't take care of them because they required 24 hours worth of care. And people have to work. They couldn't even just say lift them enough. The people that would be caregiving for them weren't even able to care for them. They go to live in a nursing home. They spend down their money that they have, their home. If they, are living in it alone, maybe it gets sold and that money goes to their care and then they end up on Medicaid. And so if we get rid of Medicaid, those nursing homes will be most largely emptied. We won't have people that can afford to stay in those things. And how will we take care of those people? What will that look like to have elderly people that you care about in your life sitting at home all day long in their own feces until you can get home from work, and then you can spend the rest of your day bathing them and feeding them and caring for them and organizing their medication and figuring out how you're going to, do the next thing you need to do with them? How will that impact your life? How will it impact your life when those nursing homes close? Do you know how many people are employed by a nursing home? If you fall out the window of your house, you probably land in a nursing home parking lot. What will we do with all those people that won't have work? What are we going to do? What does it look like in a community that has a lot of federal workers that are now going to get fired? What does that look like? Does that look like housing prices flying apart because you're going to have a bunch of people who lose their homes? And then what? Are other people going to buy them? Or are they just going to be bought up by, big corporations? And then you won't, then they can charge whatever they want for rent for it. Think about what that's going to look like in your community. What will it happen if there are tons of desperate and hungry people in your community? Do you feel safer? Are you like, oh, but I have a gun? So what, you're going to shoot people because they're hungry and scared and trying not to die? That's the future you want? You think that you're going to have some pristine castle around you where your gun will protect you? I mean, people really need to stop and think about what this looks like. What these policies that DOGE are trying to do is going to actually look like in your life. If you can't imagine, if you don't have enough empathy to imagine things for other people, you need to start to try and figure out, what is this going to look like in your life?